And we can hear you.
Awesome.
Right. Go ahead and get started here. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. Faces that have been here before, new faces, is much appreciated. So, for those of you who don't know, this is the first time in our series for the Department of Anthropology. I'm Nick Barron, so I'll be hosting today's event. And today we are joined by our guest speaker, Dr. Ariel Gruenthal-Rankin. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. And before locating to UW, she earned her PhD in anthropology from Binghamton University on dietary dimensions of early life stress in medieval Prussia. She's also the recipient of that particular institution's Edward H. Prentice Award, which recognizes distinguished scholarship and contributions to academic and extracurricular life. And along with her current position, Dr. Gruenthal-Rankin also serves as a forensic anthropologist for the Honolulu County Department of Medical Examiner. Her areas of research and expertise are varied but overlapping as they attend to anthropological practice and emergent meta-level discussions concerning things like ethics and utility of forensic anthropology, topics that I know are of immense interest to people in this department. And these areas of research range from skeletal pathology to structural violence and marginalization to the development of health and disease to community-oriented forensic practices, which I'm sure we're going to hear about more today based on the title alone. She's also the lead author of numerous publications, the most recent being the article titled Beyond the Report, Perspectives and Challenges in Forensic Anthropological Investigations of Structural Vulnerability, featured in Forensic Science International Synergy. The talk today is titled, Who Are Our Stakeholders? Building a Community-Oriented Practice of Forensic Anthropology. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gruenthal-Rankin. So round of applause.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I'm very excited to come and talk with you all. I appreciate you coming to a talk about stakeholders because this is probably a little bit different than some of the forensic talks we have heard before. So the talk today is going to focus on stakeholders within our community, how we can move toward a forensic anthropology that focuses on external stakeholders beyond the medico-legal system, which is a major focus of my work. So in terms of an overview for today, we'll talk a little bit about the scope of the problem in terms of defining stakeholders, who counts in forensic scenarios. We'll talk about some of the traditional stakeholders that are identified kind of across forensic subdisciplines. So within the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, we have 12 sections that do different functions within forensics, from nursing to criminology, pathology. Each one of them identifies their stakeholders differently, but I think you'll see probably that there's a lot of overlap. We want to talk about who is affected by forensic work because I think that this is a real area for forensics that needs growth and acknowledgement that there are people beyond the medico-legal system who are affected by our work. Right, so the real question here is who counts when we're thinking about forensics? And then finally, toward the end of the talk today, we will cover what a community-oriented practice looks like, how it might vary depending on the region that you work in, depending on your identity, depending on the particular constraints of your job. There are lots of factors that go into the way that we practice our version of anthropology. So we'll talk about all of that. And I'll give you guys some kind of ideas based on examples from here in Hawaii of how we can focus on community issues in different areas of anthropological practice. And then finally, we'll look at the path forward, the ways that we can incorporate community. Maybe we also want to talk about activism or advocacy in our work, which are kind of touchy subjects right now in forensic anthropology. So we'll touch on those a little bit as well. I think they're all kind of intertwined. So we'll definitely speak about that throughout. And we'll end today with sort of a reflection on solidarity and what it means to be in community with people. So one of the major stumbling blocks, I think, for anthropological, well, I'll say forensic anthropological investigations of stakeholders is that first and foremost, they never define what we're talking about. Before we can get started in talking about what being a stakeholder actually means, we need to know who actually is a stakeholder. So essentially, the most basic definition is anyone who's affected in some way by the research or applied work that we conduct. And if you are an archaeologist, if you are a cultural anthropologist, I mean, even if you are a bioarchaeologist, this is probably a discussion that you had in your subfield in the 1970s or 1980s, right? For forensic anthropology, because in some ways our discipline has become detached from the broader practice of a holistic anthropology, we are having these conversations now. So we're a little behind in some ways when it comes to thinking about participatory research and community engagement, because in part, we spend a lot of time in our labs. We spend a lot of time behind the scenes. There are a lot of people that traditionally stand between us and family members and community. And so for a long time, we haven't really had to think about stakeholders beyond the immediate people that we talk to on a regular basis. Those people are often members of the medico-legal field, right? So the traditional stakeholders, if you go through forensic literature, it doesn't matter what subdiscipline really, the main stakeholders are the same. They are pathologists, medical examiners, and coroners. For forensic anthropologists, that is very much the kind of area that we focus in because we work very closely with pathologists and medical examiners. They're usually the ones who bring us into casework, right? So that's kind of our main articulation with this system. And then we also have law enforcement who we do interact with, especially when we're assisting with identifications, cold cases, things like that, where we're helping with kind of longer standing missing persons cases and things like that. We're going to articulate more with law enforcement. And then also attorneys and judges, right? So we have this realm within the kind of medical and investigative side of the field, and then also this realm within the judicial system. And these people will always be identified as the stakeholders of forensic casework. So there have been discussions in forensic anthropology really since about 2020 about who counts as stakeholders in part. And these are the people who are always listed. We also articulate with jurors within the courtroom in a very limited way, right? Mostly we're talking at them. They're not engaging with us in dialogue or anything like that necessarily. I think this is probably as close as most forensic practitioners get to community in some way. So this is our small view into community, just these jurors. Occasionally, we also work with next of kin, but that's pretty rare. Usually, the only time we're going to talk to next of kin is if someone else asks us to, right? So if the medical examiner or pathologist asks us to come in and sit with family and talk about some of the more detailed or kind of complicated aspects of the forensic analysis, interpretation of evidence, and things like that. But we are not often in community with people other than those immediately around us in the medico-legal world. In doing an analysis of forensic articles and chapters that focus on disclosure of information, stakeholders, and things like that, one of the things that you'll see most often is the phrase key stakeholders. And the funny thing about this is that whenever they use these terms, they tend to be poorly defined. Sometimes they just say key stakeholders and never talk about the people behind that at all. So it leaves you to wonder who is significant, who counts, who is affected in some way by these different forensic disciplines. We don't really have a good idea because no one really explicitly says it. So I tend to lean toward a more humanitarian focus when it comes to thinking about who counts in forensic contexts, because we see within humanitarian work, both within and outside of the US, there's a much broader range of people that are identified as being affected by our work. And I think this is an area that has been growing since at least the 80s, this international component where we actually see anthropologists engaging with really diverse communities of people, different stakeholders, and really focusing on humanitarian work. But within the US, that work is very limited. We see it definitely along the border between US and Mexico. And we see it a bit with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, right? We see humanitarian work in some contexts within the domestic realm, but for the most part, forensic anthropology's efforts to kind of focus on social justice, focus on marginalization and structural violence are occurring outside of the US by and large. But I think that there is a growing number of us who recognize that these issues also pertain to our communities that we live in today, not just those very at-risk people, but everyone in our community. So in terms of the stakeholders that are identified in more kind of humanitarian contexts, we see things like nonprofits and NGOs being a major factor in diverse stakeholders. We see next of kin and their communities as well, missing persons groups and advocates, and governmental task forces. So especially when it comes to international human rights, we're often working with governmental organizations and task forces, but even within our states, especially now with the rise of investigation into issues affecting Indigenous communities, we see task forces popping up across our states. So these are just some of the stakeholders that we see when we broaden our understanding of who counts in forensic contexts. And you can probably, if you are a forensic person, you can probably think of even more people who are affected in some way by our work, and who may be someone that we could reach out to engage with. This diagram came out in 2019 from Al Mazrui et al. And it's really about forensic disclosure, so the sharing of forensic information. But I think it works well for this discussion as well, because it helps us map out all of the players that we're looking at in a forensic context. So we have the forensic examiner in the center, who's kind of anchoring this diagram. And then we have 4 different domains. We have forensic services, investigative domains, legal domains, and then our external stakeholders. And I think that even if we're not looking at the external stakeholders, when we look at these other domains, we see a lot of people that we don't often think about as being related to us in some way in a forensic context. Because oftentimes, forensic anthropologists are never going to see a first responder, maybe if they're helping us like with a very tricky recovery or something like that, or paramedics. We're never going to see eyewitnesses really. But all of these people are stakeholders in this process, even if we don't come into articulation with them directly. Most often, again, we're seeing people in that forensic services domain. So we may be talking with other forensic examiners, especially in instances where we're working on like disasters and things like that. People who are managing our casework, medical examiners for sure, we're always talking to them. crime scene investigators, at least within a medical examiner system, we're coming into contact with those crime scene investigators a lot as well. And then obviously we're coming into the legal domain. But I'm mostly interested in these external stakeholders and the way that we think about them and our articulations with them. So in this diagram, they have identified policymakers and government authorities, independent external agencies, academics, media, and family and friends. Now, we are pretty comfortable working with other academics. That's a given. A lot of our research work is being disseminated directly to academics without much access to any of the other external stakeholders, including the medical examiners and people like that in some instances. Some of us are more comfortable than others with the media side of things, and sometimes you kind of get thrust into it whether you want to be or not. But I think family and friends could be expanded to include the broader community. And then I think that the policymakers and government authorities is a really interesting and important piece of this puzzle, especially when you start working with community, because policy is something that you're going to hear about over and over from community members. The goal for many community members is to move toward policy change. And when you work with these communities, they're going to make it very clear that they want your help to get to that place of policy change. So it is really important for us as forensic anthropologists, if we want to move into this realm of community-based practices, to also feel comfortable with policy and kind of dipping our toes into that. So you might be thinking, okay, I'm a forensic anthropologist, and I love the idea of thinking about a broader concept of stakeholders, but I don't know how to do it. Like, how do we take that first step? Because as I mentioned, forensic anthropology is really detached in some ways from the broader field of anthropology. So we don't always benefit in the same way from the knowledge that's already been established outside of our subfield. And when we're looking for models within forensics of how to engage with community, it's pretty sparse. There's not a whole lot there. And so it can feel really overwhelming to get started or to know what the first step looks like, right? We're used to seeing people just jumping right in and doing participatory research with communities, but how do you take those first steps? And this is why I think it's really important for those who are interested in building a community practice to come into community together as practitioners. And it seems like we tend to find each other and create these networks. And I hope today, for those who are interested in this kind of practice, that I can be a member of your network as well to help you with understanding and navigating this world, because it is pretty new for forensic practitioners. But having others who work with community members on a regular basis kind of share their stumbling blocks and share their successes really is helpful for building your own practice. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a forensic colleague only, right? Because we're very lucky that many other fields of anthropology have been doing community-based work for many, many years, right? So community-based participatory research is really common in sociocultural anthropology, in archaeology. We see it even in bioarchaeology, especially with all of the concerns about excavating human remains and whether descendant communities are involved with that process. So there are many people within our field who already do this kind of work, which is a great resource that we need to tap into. Even within biological anthropology, right? So bioarchaeologists definitely work with descendant communities more broadly, but also human biologists do it a lot. And so there are some great models out there for working with community from biological anthropology that we can also lean on. For example, here we have, let me see if I can move that there. Here we have a whiteboard that was a larger brainstorm that occurred in the second meeting of what would become the Health Equity Alliance of Tallahassee. So this is a community-based alliance with researchers, specifically with Dr. Lance Gravely, who is an incredible researcher who kind of straddles the line between human biology and medical anthropology. He, I think, would probably identify himself as a medical anthropologist, but he's certainly in both worlds. The goal of the Health Equity Alliance of Tallahassee is community-based participatory research. So the community members come up with ideas about what they want to dig into with their own health. And then Dr. Gravely and others help with forming research questions and research design. They also train community members on collecting blood spots and things like that for testing. And you can see on this whiteboard, there are some like major points that the community has identified as important to them. One, what are you going to do with this research, right? Because when you are conducting research with community members, the last thing that anybody wants is to extract resources from the community and then leave, right? Use your research for whatever you want and never come back to disseminate it with the community, never talk to them about what happened. They want to know, they have a stake as stakeholders, they have a stake in what happens. The second thing they've identified is money. And this is obviously a really important piece of the puzzle when we're working with community. Specifically, where does the money go, right? Because funding agencies love this approach of community-focused work. But when we are pulling in that money as PIs, we need to be thinking about how we're using that money within the community. That means things like reimbursing people for their time, community members for their time, understanding that there are different forms of knowledge and that it's not just academics who deserve to be paid for their knowledge and time. So directing money to important key resources within your community as identified by your stakeholders. And then also incorporating multiple PIs and also multiple co-authors. So for me, one of the things I try to focus on when I do community-based research is always including community members as co-authors. And this is the same thing you'll see with the Health Equity Alliance research that comes out, is often there are community co-authors as well, because they have a stake in it. Obviously, for some of them, having another publication or something like that is not a main focus for them because they're not pushing towards tenure or something like that. But it's a recognition of the time and the knowledge and the deep connection to their community that they have to be able to make them a PI, a co-PI, or make them a co-author or a lead author, depending on how much of the work they've actually, contributed to the research that's coming out. When it comes to forensic scales of community engagement, I think there are really three areas that we can target as areas to grow into community. The first is research, the second is applied work, and the third are community-based collaborative projects. You might be thinking that sounds like research, but the difference here is that community-based collaborative projects are not happening with the intention of producing like a paper or a conference presentation or something like that from it. This is something that is entirely driven by community need, that is not about benefiting in some sort of academic way from it. It's serving a need within your community. And certainly these scales can overlap. and integrate in with each other. But I've separated them out just so we can be clear, because for some of us, we might be comfortable designing research that addresses inequity within our communities, but we might not be as comfortable going out into community when we're doing forensic casework of some sort and actually talking with community members or something like that, or designing a huge project that can be very unwieldy when we're working with a lot of people. So we'll look at each one of these so that we have an understanding of different entry points for community work. Let me keep moving this around. There we go. So to my way of thinking, forensics has pretty much always been a community issue. If we think about missing persons, if we think about unidentified people who are recovered from different contexts around the community, people know about it, people talk about it. And certainly for me, being in Hawaii, it's a very, it's a spread out state, but it's also a very small community in some ways. So information, gossip, all sorts of stuff comes back very fast. It makes its way around the state and comes back to you pretty quickly. So anytime you see a missing person, there is a larger community connected to them. It's not just their parents or some of their friends. It's a whole community a lot of times that's mourning the loss of this person and trying to find them. And same thing for murder victims and things like that. So the way I see it is that forensics has always been a community issue. And so we need to reach out and ask community members where the need is. And one of the things that I have found so exciting about working with community is that they seem to always have an answer for what they need, which for researchers and things like that is really exciting, because I have one view of forensics and what is necessary in forensics. But the community members that are affected as external stakeholders have a totally different view of the things that are needed for their community. And I've often found that if it may not be the case that community members know what a forensic anthropologist does right off the bat, but once I explain it, they're like, oh, could you help me with this? Or what about this? I've noticed this policy is really out of date or whatever. So community members always have answers to what the need is. And so it's really just about listening to them. So for example, when I first arrived here in Hawaii, and I'm still very new, I'm in my first year here, so I'm still building those community networks, and that will be an ongoing process probably forever. But when I first got here, one of the first community members I connected with was the lead author on a report on missing and murdered Native Hawaiian women and girls throughout the state. She is a Kanaka Maoli, which means Native Hawaiian woman, and she's also a community researcher. And so in talking with her, she walked me through a lot of the challenges they've come up with as they write reports that are mandated by the state on missing and murdered Native Hawaiian women and girls. So the state of Hawaii in 2022 established a task force to examine this crisis. And you may notice, if you are someone who has had any interaction with the larger missing and murdered Indigenous relatives movement, that Native Hawaiian women and girls and Mahu, who are like a Hawaiian version of Two-Spirit people, Native Hawaiian people are often left out of the larger discussions of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. So this is a really important moment for our state to be able to really look into this. And one of the things that's really exciting about this project is that the task force was led by the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women. So it was led by a women's organization, led by a feminist office, which is incredible. Now, since been disbanded, which is very sad. And also the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. So it was formed, this task force was led and formed by people who have a clear stake in this discourse, which is incredible. And then members of the task force were mandated by the state. My collaborator, Dr. Cristobal, was brought in as the PI for the project to do the actual research, but she was also on the task force. And when I talk to her, what I hear is just a ton of challenges. And it's not surprising because we know these issues are out there based on other states' experiences with collecting data on missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. So the challenges in Hawaii, though, are somewhat different because of the unique colonial history of the state. So, for example, one of the major issues that came up was that there was a really deep connection between militarism and tourism and sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is one of those kind of gateways to becoming a missing or murdered Indigenous woman. So sex trafficking is a huge issue, but when we look at the task force and who kind of the specific members of the task force were, we're missing the presence of the military, and like almost entirely, and we're missing the tourism board. We're missing someone who has some sort of connection to the tourism of the state, who are all kind of deeply implicated in sex trafficking and this kind of pipeline to becoming a missing person. In 2019, the Honolulu PD did a sting operation to catch people who were trying to sex traffic, specifically younger girls, in Operation Keiki Shield. And what they found is that 38% of the arrested sex offenders were active duty military. And so military presence is a complicated thing here in Hawaii, but it would be important to have someone from the military present on this type of task force because they represent someone who's causing a lot of harm within communities. Additionally, a challenge of creating this larger report and analyzing data on missing and murdered Native Hawaiian women and girls was that law enforcement collects slightly different data depending on the county that we're looking at. This is something that if you're in forensics in your own state, you probably have noticed this. People kind of collect slightly different data, and law enforcement officers are not researchers. And this is something I've heard from community researchers and something I've heard from law enforcement, like, I don't know what data to give to the community researchers because I'm not a researcher. I don't know what's important. So there are points where you can hear how an anthropologist can create a bridge to kind of connect these people who aren't always talking the same language. So for example, a big stumbling block for this report that was written is that data on social race was aggregated and can't be disaggregated. So for example, everyone who is Asian Pacific Islander in Hawaii are pooled into the same pot for missing persons reports and things like that. The problem is that if you just want to study the effects of militarism, tourism, colonialism on Native Hawaiian women and girls, you can't pull them out, you can't disaggregate them from this larger category of Asian Pacific Islander, because oftentimes that data is just not even collected. And so as biological anthropologists, we know that social race is not the same thing as ancestry or anything like that. But for community researchers, this is the type of data they need, and they don't have it. There are also major biases in the categories of missing versus running away, so a runaway. So white girls and white women are more often, it's not a surprise to anyone who does this work, more often classified as missing within our state. And missing Native Hawaiian girls are almost always start off as runaways, based on the police kind of analysis of the case. So we lose time in the beginning of when these girls go missing because we're treating it as a runaway case rather than a true missing persons case. And the other problem, of course, is that data is not always made available to our community or even to researchers as mandated by law. So my collaborator, Dr. Cristobal, was saying that one of the issues is that there's one county, my county, which is the largest, like most populous area, did not contribute data at all, even though they're mandated by law to do so. And they were mandated by law to be on the task force, neither of which happened. And so we're missing a lot of information here because community can't access these data. And that's a major problem for investigating a huge crisis within our state and our nation. So research is one way that we can approach community. And the way that we can work in solidarity with community when we're designing research is to ask the right questions. So we may want to kind of touch base and talk with our community members and hear what they have to say about what is important to them, what the major issues for your state might be, and then you can design research that really addresses some of that. So you might ask yourself, do our methods account well for the people we actually see in our casework? Right? This is where community work connects to advocacy and activism, I think, is really in the way we ask questions in research. So for example, some of my work prior to kind of moving into forensics wholeheartedly was in the developmental origins of health and disease hypothesis. So within bioarchaeology, I was looking at this interdisciplinary framework from epidemiology and clinical medicine that examines the lasting effects of our childhood experiences on our bodies. Factors that are affected by early life experiences that we can see in the skeleton include things like fluctuating asymmetry, so slight asymmetrical differences from side to side, as well as growth disruptions. And these may very well affect our estimations of the biological profile, which is a key component of our casework, but we just don't know because we haven't been digging into interdisciplinary research within our field. But this is definitely a way that we can account for people who have a broader range of experiences in childhood. I think there are lots of different ways to go about this type of work, but I think it's really important to for my practice at least, to focus on research design versus identifying marginalization in a case report. Because my goal in working with community is to not cause additional harm to them. And I feel like within a case report, if I am like including a section that talks about marginalization of that person, their experiences, we run the risk of causing further harm, whether that's police deciding they don't want to allot as much time and resources to this person because perhaps they were lower socioeconomic status or houseless. I don't want to add to harm in any way for my community. And then we can also do this work in applied contexts, which is a little bit more difficult, where we can act as a bridge between community and law enforcement. So within applied context, we really need to focus, or I try to focus at least, on hearing what the community is saying. So this was really apparent after the Lahaina fire in Maui, where I'm working with the kind of law enforcement side of things, but I'm also hearing things from community members that's coming through to me, saying that they're really asking for transparency. There is a lot of stuff that went unsaid in this disaster that caused the community to become concerned, become nervous, right? The fact that the death toll was up high and then dropped down to the community looks like somebody's messing with numbers. When in fact, what happened was every recovery was getting a new case number. And it turned out that some of those recoveries were non-human. So that case number goes away and the death toll comes down. If there was someone like an anthropologist to bridge that gap and explain that, it would have generated more trust within the community, and we wouldn't have had people going in to recover their loved ones at night and things like that because they were scared they would never be recovered otherwise. So as anthropologists, connecting into that broader understanding of a holistic practice, we know that structural violence affects communities. And anthropologists can really help to build capacity within the structures we work in through praxis, so theoretically informed action. And that is where we can start to shift structures or create new ones that better address the needs of every stakeholder. Collaborative projects are also a great way to involve community. There are numerous database projects that are popping up where we are collecting missing and unidentified person information for the state and putting them into an external database. This has happened in Louisiana. They're now mandated by law to hold these records. Mississippi, Hawaii, I'm sure there's more. We're working on these projects in conjunction with community. Now, there's a system that already exists to deal with this issue. It's NamUs. It's a national system. But community members and people on the forensic side express some challenges associated with working with NamUs. The first is that there are missing. So the amount of people who are uploaded into NamUs is not always the same as the amount of people who are actually missing within the state. And this is because there's only about 13 states that require that a case be uploaded to NamUs. Additionally, once a case is closed, either the missing person is found, dead or alive, or the unidentified person is identified, the case within NamUs becomes archived, which means that it's not viewable to the public anymore. So external researchers who want to do work on the kind of deep temporal history of missing and unidentified people in a state can't access that information anywhere. And it's not subject to FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, so you can't actually request that information from NamUs either. There are very limited options for the full range of ancestries and gender identities within NamUs, so we don't get good information that's robust for researchers. And that's because it's primarily focused on criminal investigation, but would be an excellent resource for researchers to create policy change if they could access this information. So the goal of database projects that are external to NamUs, in part, is to move some of that power away from NamUs and these national organizations and into community hands, so they can create databases, they can submit their loved ones to these databases and things like that, and feel a sense of connection and transparency in this work. And this is how we can then use these data to influence policy change, which is what most community members I talk to really want to see. So in closing, I would recommend, if you're interested in doing community level work, start with what you feel comfortable doing. And this always depends on your identity, your career level, the type of job that you're in. If you're working for the government, it may not be possible to do all the things that you want to do. So start where you're comfortable, start where you feel safe enacting that change, and then simply show up. If there is an event that is relevant to your expertise or that you're passionate about within the community, go there. Go there and meet people. And then as you start to network, show up for those people again and again and again until they can see that you're not just talking words, you're actually showing them through your actions that you're going to show up for community. I find it super helpful to just tell people what I do and ask them what's needed. Because again, people always know. People know what's needed within their communities and they're going to tell you. And one of the amazing things for someone who's a transplant like myself, who's new, is that I learn a lot of information about my state and my local community really fast. So I find community members really insightful about the specific challenges and needs of their communities, especially when it comes to the articulation of community members with law enforcement in particular. A reminder that all stakeholders count, even if they don't agree with you. Unfortunately, we like to think that everyone's going to agree with us and everything's going to go great. But if someone tells you to stop, you stop. Every community member counts the same. So if someone is uncomfortable with what's happening, you pause, you work it out, or you try to find a different approach, right? When we're doing community work, the community sets the pace of what we do. And then finally, really thinking about from research to casework to applied kind of projects, really centering community and thinking about reducing the harm that you may create. I think that is most important to me. I often ask myself as I plan new research, like, is there a way that this research can be used to be harmful in some way to my community? And if it is, then I'm probably not going to do it, right? And a great way to ensure that your practices are, not as harmful as they could be is to just incorporate community members into every part of your work. And they'll check you, they'll tell you when you're doing something that is harmful in some way. So that's a great way to keep you kind of on track. I wanted to end today with a reflection on commitment from Bell Hooks. Solidarity is not the same as support. To experience solidarity, we must have a community of interests, shared beliefs, and goals around which to unite to build sisterhood. Support can be occasional, it can be given and just as easily withdrawn. Solidarity requires sustained, ongoing commitment. And that's really kind of what I see in community work, is that sustained, ongoing commitment to change within your community. Some references for you, some acknowledgements to the community members that I work with and my mentors and colleagues and the medical examiners. And a big thank you to you all at UNLV for hosting me today. And a special thanks to Katie Gaddis for initiating the invitation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
Thank you so much, Ariel. I've noticed from these recordings, the sound of the applause doesn't always come through, so just know that it was a wall of sound.
Great. Yeah, I couldn't hear anything.
So thank you so much. So yeah, we do have time for questions. So if anybody has them, please feel free to raise your hands. If not, I'll get it going because I do have one that's kind of more of a slightly historical question, but I suppose not really, because it's a little bit more general. So you mentioned at the start of the talk, you were saying that this kind of new shift towards this more community-oriented approach in forensic anthropology, relatively recent. You kind of mentioned like 2020. I'm just curious, what do you think, what accounts for that shift? Is it something that's internal to the subfield, like generational shifts, or is it something that's more external, how forensic anthropologists now work with these, like maybe the more traditional stakeholder communities, like just basically what might account for it, even if it's just, speculative?
Yeah, well, I think a big shift for many people in the nation was the murder of George Floyd. I think that was something that really sparked a lot of conversation within our field about the research we're doing and the things that we're including in our case report that may inadvertently cause harm to people, like the inclusion of ancestry assessments on an unidentified person's case that may in turn affect how resources are directed to certain cases, right? That's something that really caught my attention and made me think about the ways that we can inadvertently cause harm. And that, obviously we're not trying to harm our communities, but that's a way that we can do it without even really thinking about it. And so I think that there was a lot of internal dialogue within our discipline when George Floyd was murdered, about who counts in forensics, and whether it's just the medico-legal side of things or whether there are broader stakeholders that we need to be considering. So I think that was really the turning point, in my opinion. Can she hear me if I say it from here?
You might have to, project a little bit.
All right, so my question is kind of about how do you navigate timelines and also working with like the community and their needs. Like, for example, I'm doing my master's. It's a very short timeline. I'm very interested in the concept of like slow violence. I mean, not slow violence, slow science, but like sometimes it doesn't align. So what's your advice?
Yeah, that's totally true. And as someone who works a lot with Indigenous researchers, the timeline is slow. That is the process. A lot of these kind of timelines don't align with white Western science timelines. So at a master's level, we have to recognize that, like, number one, you're not doing a PhD. So don't try to make it a PhD, first of all. Like, don't try to make the scale so huge that you're going to spend 5 years doing your master's. And if you are inclined toward the slow science side of things, the community engagement side of things, I think that maybe the place to look is a smaller project that can be done in that time with a more robust theoretical framing of Indigenous research methods, slow science, and community engagement. So you can build a small project and then a more robust theoretical framework around it. And that would be a way to make sure that you are hitting the goals that you need to hit for your timeline, but also still staying true to the type of science that you want to be doing. And I think in forensics, we have shied away from those robust theoretical frameworks a bit. So it's definitely needed. And it's definitely something that's going to add a lot of value, I think, to our field. If that helps.
So as a transplant, and I think most academics, including forensic ants, are, very transitory. Very rarely do you get to work in the place that you grew up or, have lived in for quite a while. So how do you keep yourself in check and kind of cognizant of political discourse, I guess, because these stakeholders aren't apolitical, and you probably, anyone going into a new setting doesn't know all of the political, interests among various stakeholders, and, the stakeholders that are there, with the missing, it's a very similar transition concept with, the missing stakeholders. So how do you, I don't know, kind of learn about, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, it's tricky. And you will find that in the same way that you're wanting to engage with community members to get to learn more about the community, they are wanting to engage with you in part to enact change, but also because you have a position that is useful to them in some way too. So there's always that kind of political jostling that happens when working with community members. And my best recommendation, and it's tricky, but I think hearing from a lot of stakeholders helps. Because oftentimes, like, for example, I work with a lot of community organizers and advocates, and they know each other. Like, even if they're on different islands, they know each other. So they can tell me things like, oh, that person is trying to enact this kind of policy change, or that person is in conflict with, this whole like law enforcement system. I think you get a sense of it pretty quickly when you talk with people. And so you just have to be mindful of not overcommitting yourself before you understand the dynamics of the community. And those are always changing, and it takes a while. So I think one of the things that I struggle with, and that probably others who are gravitating toward this work struggle with, is walking before you can run. So don't try to just like jump out of the gate and do tons of stuff, because you really do have to have a pretty sophisticated understanding of the political environment that you're working in. So slowing down, again, that slow science idea, slowing it down so that you can get to know people first, and recognizing you may not be doing capital R research right out of the gate. It might just be a lot of networking. But that's the way to kind of buffer yourself against these kind of unforeseen political things that can come up, I think. But they always will anyway.
Yeah, this is Dan Benishek. I'm a faculty member in the
Hi.
department. Thanks so much for the talk. Really interesting. I'm a medical anthropologist and have done some community-based participatory research myself. One of the things that strikes me about your talk is the maybe particular challenges that forensic anthropologists might face in these contexts. So, what I'm thinking about here is, in many cases, I'm guessing that the community may view you as part of those other traditional stakeholders, be they law enforcement, legal, et cetera. And you're another one of those experts, right? Working, and I'm also thinking about a lot of the stuff I've been reading about Lahaina and the community sort of suspicions and resentment there. And I'm wondering how difficult it is to perhaps be seen as part of those traditional stakeholders outside of the local community when you're trying to build bridges with them, when there's maybe that suspicion and anger. I mean, is that something that you run into? And does that mean that independent forensic anthropologists need to try to build those bridges, or can you, as a person that's maybe working that case, still do that?
Yeah, that was a really difficult, I run into that a lot. And it's a really difficult thing, especially with Lahaina, because again, you know, I'm working with the law enforcement side of things, but I'm hearing from community members, the concern, the lack of transparency, the suspicion. And I'm seeing the governmental side play out in a way that is directly harmful in some ways to the community. And I understand why the community is feeling that way. And so, yeah, I run into that, being in both worlds, or being, you know, seeming like I'm aligned more with one side, with the kind of law enforcement side of things. And so I'm really clear with community members when I start that I contract with medical examiners. I fully see myself as someone who exists outside of the law enforcement entity. And I am very honest with the community members about the fact that I understand the harm that law enforcement often causes within their communities. And I understand the distrust that's there. And usually once I talk to them about how I see my role and how I articulate with that system, they can see that I'm like relatively independent of that in some ways, especially for like Lahaina, because I went there as a volunteer. So there wasn't that same kind of like monetary enmeshment. But yeah, it really is about building trust. And again, I think that's where showing up for community just over and over and over again, and demonstrating through your actions that you are working in solidarity with them, helps a lot. But I think there are always going to be people who see me as aligned with that system and not trustworthy because of that. And I think that's just the nature of the beast. And there are going to be people who don't trust me. And that's fair. And that's their choice as well, you know. But yeah, that's the trickiest part, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Close us out with the last question.
I'm Mr. Brian Vilmar, and I'm not in forensic science. In fact, I'm a anthropologist, so this is totally new to me. And you had discussed when you were talking about George Floyd, how like there was harm that could be caused by forensics itself. And I totally get police, that I get. But how does forensic science, like in what way would it cause harm? Like what way does the science that you do?
Yeah. So I think the example that came out during George Floyd, there's kind of a larger conversation about estimating ancestry or biodistance in our case reports. And one of the things that we really kind of focused on was the idea of the missing white woman syndrome, and how when white women go missing, they get so much more attention and all the resources, money, time, all of that to find them. They get more media coverage. But if we're forensic anthropologists and we're writing out these ancestry sections in our case report, and they're going to investigators who we know at times can be very biased in the way they choose to pursue cases, we have to question whether the stuff that we're contributing is kind of indirectly potentially harmful to community. And I think everybody differs on whether they think that we have an obligation as scientists to think about that or not. And there are definitely people that are like, hey, I'm just doing the science. How they choose to use my science is like beyond the realm of what I can control. And I definitely understand that. But I think that if there are ways that we can disrupt that, the potential of harm, then it's worth considering. And I think another way that we see this in forensics is through the way that we very often use certain demographics as our reference samples for building new methods and things like that, where we end up leaving out a lot of different people of different ancestries or people with different lived experiences because they are more challenging to account for in some way. For example, like intersex people or trans people may not be included in traditional kind of sex estimation methods because it's easier to do the binary of male and female, but we're missing people. And when we are excluding people from building our methods, to my mind, has the possibility to create harm because it means that we're going to be less accurate when we're working on those kind of cases.
Thanks. I was just like, I'm gonna follow up, like,
Yeah.
I assume there's a form you fill out that lists like ancestry estimation. I mean, how would you actualize that? Would you leave it blank or put a probability number or somehow like it's tricky, like how you would make that happen. I get the missing white woman syndrome. This is like a thing in our house. My daughters are always like, oh yeah, right. So, I mean, totally understandable. But in your role, how does that, that seems tricky. Because there is information, you might want to withhold it, but then you're withholding information in this context that people might use to identify the person who's missing.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think that is really an investigator by investigator kind of thing. So some of us will continue to include ancestry with, the probabilities associated and all of that. Some of us may include a statement underneath about the inaccuracies that occur in ancestry and biodistance estimation and things like that. Others may choose to exclude it entirely because there are issues with, especially like not so much the measurements that we take from the skull, but our kind of macroscopic techniques where we're like just using our eyes to look at the skull and scale things. So I've met anthropologists who do every version of that. Either leave it all in, no problem, it's not my problem how people interpret it, leave it in with the caveat, or exclude it entirely. And typically from the biological profile, there's still quite a lot of information that helps with narrowing down missing persons. But yeah, that is a risk that we run, that if we leave out something, it could be the thing that helps with identification.
I think the families would want that to be in there somewhere, right?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, unless it's being used in a harmful way against them. Yeah.
Be cognizant of the times. We are a few minutes over. So thank you.
All right.
Sorry.
Okay, one more round of applause. No, if we can. Yeah, I don't know if I'm on the other end, but it was louder than before. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Thanks.